Welcome again to TYT Interviews. If I'm here, I'm Dave Koller. It means we must be talking about Latin America, and this time you are right. I have with me today Dr. Jeffery Weber, Professor of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary, University of London. Dr. Weber, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The Young Turks audience and the Young Turks show and all our programming is mostly U.S.-centered. When we talk about international affairs, it's often the Middle East or someplace where the U.S. is currently sticking its fingers. If we mention Latin America, it's a one-off story here or there. Argentinian bondholders taking a ship hostage or some revolts somewhere. But we rarely ever get to paint a complete picture of what's going on in South America, Latin America, overall, broadly for our audience. And I pop in every once in a while on some of the TYT programming with a story here or there. But in this interview, I want to try to give the audience a general sense of what's been going on in Latin America the past 10 to 15 years with this wave of left-leaning leadership and what it has accomplished and whether it's really over and how we can assess it. So, Dr. Weber, let's start there. It's broad, it's very wide open for you, but let's determine whether this is a real or fiction. Was there a wave of left-leaning leadership in South America over the past 15 years, or is it a figment of our imagination? So please, let's start there. So was there a wave of leftist leadership?
Okay, well, I think the way I like to think about the left is in slightly more expansive terms than just the leadership, but also to think of social movement, party, and regime modalities all together. And I think if you take that kind of broad perspective, then there's no doubt that there was a quite dramatic shift to the left at the beginning. The late 1990s, early 2000s is when it begins. And I think the first expression of this is really extra-parliamentary social movements that grow out of the economic crisis of neoliberalism between 1998 and 2002, a very, very steep recession after about 15, 20 years of neoliberal restructuring in the region. And at the end of that 1990s, you really had right-wing governments in office in almost all of South America, Central America, and into Mexico. And you see all of these entering into a political crisis out of the economic crisis that neoliberalism enters into. And in that vacuum, a series of strikes, road blockades, new peasant movements, indigenous uprisings start to emerge, seeking an alternative, often a radical alternative to neoliberalism, sometimes even taking an ideological guise of anti-capitalism. And they have the capacity to overthrow a series of neoliberal governments in Argentina, Ecuador, and Bolivia in particular, and with massive mobilizations also in Brazil with the landless rural workers movement, or the MST, major movements happening throughout the region. And what is interesting is that by about 2003, the economics of Latin America starts to shift because internationally, a commodities boom driven by the most dynamic zone of accumulation in the world market, China, starts to drive the price of mining minerals and natural gas and oil and so on, agricultural commodities, start to spike on the international market. And this corresponds with the first electoral expression of that initially radical extra-parliamentary left. So you start to see center-left and left parties win elections in South America. And between 2003 and 2006, you have a dramatic turn politically in the formal political arena from what had been a almost entirely conservative or neoliberal sea of regimes to at least self-described left and center-left governments. And what is interesting is that when they come into office, this corresponds with this spike in commodity boom. And what it allows these regimes to do is, without actually introducing very radical policies in most instances, so modest increases in tax and royalties on natural gas and resource extraction, very little expropriation or nationalization except rhetorically, but basically new contracts signed with multinational capital on a fairly moderate basis. But even though these were moderate policies, they generated an extraordinary spike of state revenue in many cases because of the very high conjunctural prices of commodities. And what this allowed for was a significant reduction in poverty and, in some cases, levels of income inequality, without actually challenging most of the underlying social structures of society that had been inherited. Now, this was therefore necessarily fragile and contingent on these commodity prices continuing. And what you see happen is around 2011, the kind of reverberated, delayed effect of the global economic crisis between 2007 and 2008 starts to impact South America. It had already impacted Mexico and Central America, but it really resolutely hit South America a few years after it had hit the United States and the Eurozone. And it does this by way of the slowdown of China, the deceleration of commodity prices, and therefore falling state revenues. And what starts to happen, therefore, is that center-left and left regimes that had garnered their legitimacy through these relatively petty handouts, but with significant human consequences, were therefore faced with declining state revenues. And they had a class choice to make whether they redistribute the costs of austerity onto the rich, or whether they redistribute this cost onto their social bases. And they started center-left and left regimes, Brazil under Lula and then Rousseff and elsewhere, started really to introduce toward the last 4 years austerity measures that declined their legitimacy. And what that meant was you see a receding legitimacy of center-left and left governments in a context of declining commodity prices and the rise of a new right. And in the midst of that complex situation, you have as well this terrain of extra-parliamentary social movements that are both challenging the moderate character of center-left and left regimes and trying to build up an opposition both to the domestic right that is seeing renewed vigor and, of course, continuing intervention from abroad by the U.S., but not only the U.S.
All right, thank you. That's exactly the broad overview that I wanted to start with, and that paints an excellent picture that we can branch off from. Now, a Latin American cynic or a cynic would look at 150 years of Latin American history and say all these political leaders, left or right, are either incompetent or corrupt, self-serving, power-hungry, and Latin America has never really gotten its feet firmly planted and gotten itself off the ground. Was there a difference in these past 15 years or so? Do you have a sense of whether these leaders, whether it's Lula or Evo or the Kirchners or the guy in Uruguay or Peru, Bachelet in Chile, did they really take a turn where they actually cared about governing and the general welfare and prosperity of the people in their countries? Do you have a positive or a negative view of these leaders and their intentions?
Well, I think from my perspective, we can learn a lot about the politics of these leaders by shifting our attention away from the kind of psychology or motivation of the leaders about which we can know not very much, but rather how they express or don't express the desires of wider social movements and sources of power from below that are holding them in office. And I think when you do that, when you think about these leaders as expressions of wider elements of society, you get a much more holistic view of what has been happening. So, for example, as George Chicarella-Mayer has written in his very good book on Venezuela, he noted that, the title of the book is We Created Chavez, rather than Chavez created this kind of situation in Venezuela. So to the extent that these leaders were expressions of popular movements, they were much, the direction was that way rather than top down, which I think has too often been the focus of journalistic accounts of what is happening. And I think when you take that perspective, then you have a very mixed record. So for example, to take Bolivia, the case that I know best, in the early administration between 2006 and 2010, the first administration of Evo Morales, of course, the first indigenous president elected in that country, which is very significant because the country has an indigenous majority, never had an indigenous leader since the founding of the republic. In that first administration, he had come to office on the wave of an extraordinary left-indigenous quasi-insurrectionary cycle of revolt between 2000 and 2005. And he had a very radical mandate to carry out. And during that first administration, you saw, I think, an extraordinary battle between his bases to formulate the character of the Morales regime. And there were times when rhetorically Morales addressed his bases in an extremely radical character. But especially since 2010, but even in the first administration, you saw various, maneuvers and reconfiguration of the Morales regime to accommodate the agribusiness sectors of the Eastern Lowlands, Santa Cruz, and so on, but also with renewed negotiations with extractive multinational capital. And in order to do so, on the one side, Morales was speaking still this left or populist rhetoric to his social movement bases, while simultaneously, recently going to New York on a Financial Times sponsored bid to recruit foreign direct investment from the largest capitals in the international market. So I think those are contradictory elements that say a lot more about what's happening in these places than the particularities of this or that leader. But, having said that, Morales distinguishes himself as having come out of a social movement base. And that's very important in his trajectory, as did Lula in Brazil coming out of the workers' movement, and his successor, Dilma Rousseff, coming out of in fact, a Marxist organization that was in opposition to the Brazilian dictatorship. So there's a long history with some of these people of being on the left, but what that says about their trajectory once they're in office is, I think, more complicated and not reducible to their personalities.
All right. Well, I am glad to hear, I have asked several people about the shortcomings, shortfalls of Evo Morales, and I have not yet heard any serious indictment of him. No one's claiming he's perfect or anything, but I'm relieved to hear that in a country that I also love dearly, Bolivia, that they've had a president for these past 10 years who has, to speak roughly, done good for the country. So I'm happy to hear that. Now, let me talk about a little incident. I was in Bolivia in 1999-2000, and I was in Oruro, a small mining city that's past its prime. And there was a new theater there for plays built, and there's a little plaque on it that was built by China, or funded by China or the Chinese embassy. And at the time, 16 years ago, I was a little more naive about what's going on, and I was wondering, why in the world would China pay for a theater in Oruro, Bolivia? I would imagine that now that was to curry favor with the leaders of the government of Bolivia so that they could strike a bit more favorable deals for their resource extraction. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think the question of China is interesting, not just in Bolivia, but in general. And I think across the region, it's an expression of one of the limitations of the center-left dynamic. And in center-left, I include the Morales regime, although I know that others suggest that he is farther to the left. But I think in practice, when you look at the actual policies, there's little foundation to the claims that he is a radical socialist or indigenous liberationist and these kinds of rhetorical framings of his position. Where the Chinese element comes in to the dynamics of the center-left and the limitation is that overwhelmingly the structural weakness of the left economically was its inability to forge, on the one hand, regional ties of integration capable of renegotiating its position in the international division of labor. And what I mean by that is historically, Latin America inherited a situation of being a supplier of primary commodities, albeit with industrialization concentrated unevenly in different countries, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, and so on. But there was an extraordinary dependency historically on primary commodity extraction, and therefore on the prices of international commodities and their fluctuations. And what happened in the commodities boom is an acceleration of that under left governments rather than the utilization of that extraordinary revenue increase to forge regional integration projects of a counter-hegemonic variety. Now, there are various attempts at this. The ALBA integration project of Venezuela, the Bank of the South, the Sucre, and so on. But these were principally failed quite early on, mainly having to do with Brazilian opposition, Brazilian capital and Brazilian states opposition, with Brazil's alternative regional integration projects, which were, in fact, an expression of the interests of Brazilian capital. And so what that meant was that you saw in this period a dependency, an easy dependency ongoing with these commodities, which allowed, again, for poverty reduction during the high point. But once that falls down, you have the necessity, if you want to continue to prime social spending and so on, to find new lines of credit. And there was a movement, both commercially in terms of trade, but also financially in terms of looking for lines of credit towards China in South America. Most of the trading markets, most of the principal trading partners of South American regimes over the early 2000s shifted from the United States towards China. And what this allowed for potentially was a strategic realignment, a relative autonomy from the United States, with forging new negotiations with China, without any illusions that China, a bureaucratic authoritarian capitalist model, was any kind of model to follow. But it could have been a strategic repositioning of relative autonomy for the region. But the problem, the principal problem, as Claudio Katz has pointed out in a recent essay, the Argentine economist, is that these negotiations with China have been bilateral negotiations with this or that center-left regime. And although the conditionalities by Chinese loans and investment are different from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, they certainly don't come free of the interests of the Chinese state and Chinese capital. And so what you've seen is a situation of a novel imperial power, in this case, China, negotiating new asymmetrical ties of dependence with weaker bilateral regimes. Whereas if there had been a regional negotiation with China, you may have seen the ability to position Latin America's movement away from this subordinate position in the international division of labor. So one of the expressions of the weakness of what the left experience has been over the last period is that the legacy at the end looks surprisingly similar in terms of social structures and economics as the basic structures that they inherited at the beginning, albeit with new trading partners and new subordination to different external hegemons.
Yeah, even though China's been capitalist for decades, it still strikes me as strange to hear the terms in which you speak of China as Chinese capital and global, multi-national corporate terms for China. It just seems odd to me, but that's the reality of China and has been for decades. But we're not here to talk about China. So let me, twice in this interview, you've redirected me to not focus so much on the political leadership, but the underlying social movements underneath it. So now I want to redirect you back toward that. In a few countries, we are now seeing a return at the leadership level of, or a turning away from these so-called left-of-center leaders back to, center or more corporate-friendly leaders. But how is the social movement situation in countries like this, Peru, Argentina? I don't know which others we could use as examples where they're turning away from the left-of-center leaders. Are the social movements as strong as they have been in the past 20 years, 15, 20 years, or are those social movements also weakening?
It's an interesting question. I think the situation we're in now is with a resurgent right that I think nonetheless has considerable weaknesses confronting its immediate path forward, and a declining center left. And so rather than any kind of new hegemonic force of the right or the left in most parts of Latin America, you have something of an impasse, various attempts by different political forces on both sides to either re-articulate already held power or to articulate new forms of power. So to concretely look at a few cases, the turn to the right has been extraordinary since around 2008, 2009. You start to see its acceleration. And of course, when we talk about Latin America turning to the left, this was never a uniform shift. So Mexico, under Enrique Peña Nieto, was obviously a continuation of the far-right neoliberal project, albeit under the guise of the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party of Mexico. In Colombia, the continuation of the far-right politics of Uribe, Álvaro Uribe, under his successor, Santos, who had been in the Ministry of Defense under Uribe himself. And under Chile, Sebastián Piñera, until recently, with Michelle Bachelet succeeding him, was also a part of the right. So you had right-wing islands throughout this period. So the turn to the left was never as uniform as is sometimes projected. But what is novel is that beginning in 2009, you have a successful coup d'etat carried out by the right against the center-left regime of Manuel Zelaya in Honduras. You have a short while later a parliamentary coup against Lugo in Paraguay, with the reinstallation of far-right regimes in both cases, heavily militarized and paramilitarized, particularly in the Honduran case, which then become allies of these already existing far-right parties. Most significantly, in the recent period, you've had Argentina presidential elections last November, with Mauricio Macri surprisingly taking those presidential elections. It was expected that the right-wing Peronist contender under the successor of Kirchner would succeed under Peronism, but that failed. And Mauricio Macri, the former mayor of Buenos Aires, a right-wing candidate with an extraordinarily aggressive neoliberal policy, is now in the presidency of Argentina. And in Venezuela, only a month later, in December 2015, the right wins the congressional supermajority in the Congress for the first time, putting considerable pressure on the successor of Hugo Chavez, Nicolás Maduro. And in the biggest and most important, powerful country in South America, you have the parliamentary coup against Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. An extraordinary manipulation of the Constitution to overthrow the Workers' Party and install a regime committed to extreme austerity and so on. And so what you find is that in Brazil, for example, the Rousseff regime was extremely unpopular. There's no doubt about it. There was an extreme decline in the hegemony of the Workers' Party because of Rousseff's introduction of extreme austerity measures in an attempt to win over the financial markets. But that wasn't enough, and the right reconfigured around the new right-wing administration. But the new right-wing administration is itself facing massive corruption charges, has no legitimacy, no mandate, having never been elected. In Argentina, you've seen, on the one hand, a presidential victory of the right, but extraordinary strikes of the public sector workers, new neighborhood movements, a recent acceleration of women's movements against violence, all in the context of a decrease in popularity of Macri. So what you're seeing is a contradiction of center-left regimes facing their problems of continuing an easy, petty redistribution through high commodity prices and new state revenue that way. They're declining in popularity, but there seems to be, at the moment, no serious right-wing ideological project to take its place. And so there is an extraordinary flux of new social movements, new attempts to articulate different left projects to try to get out of this impasse. But it's entirely unclear at the moment which side is going to come out in the next 10, 15 years.
All right, so keeping in our style of doing a broad overview of South America, which is exactly what I intended and exactly what we're getting, there's one more big topic, probably the last for this interview, which is U.S. intervention, U.S. involvement, and we'll expand it to Canada because I know that you study the Canadian involvement, and you're, in fact, in the middle of writing a book, or according to your bio, you're writing a book, maybe you've finished, on Canadian involvement in the mining sector. So the U.S., of course, has a long, sad history of intervention in Latin America. Often it's brazen, militaristic, if it's sometimes covert, but very often very overt. I believe we're past that for the most part, but I want to check with you. Maybe it's just taken on a new form. How much interference is the United States and Canada, we'll throw that in, how much interference are South American countries getting from North American countries as they try to sort out their affairs?
I think U.S. imperialism, it has always been one of the three elements of any kind of conjunctural analysis of what's happening in Latin America, at least over the 20th century and into the present. That is to say, for any conjunctural analysis, we need to understand the organizational, ideological, military, political, sociological capacities of three forces: the popular classes and oppressed groups on the one hand, domestic ruling classes on the other, and the strength of imperialism at different times. And what's key is to think of imperialism, and in particular with the US rise to the most dominant imperialist power by some distance since World War II, is to think of it in a dynamic sense. That is to say that the form that U.S. imperialism assumes and that other imperialisms assume is not static, unchanging, but shifts dramatically, both in economic terms, but also in diplomatic, military, ideological, cultural terms as well. And so it's not surprising that the forms of U.S. intervention have changed while the underlying motivations of the U.S. in Latin America have remained fundamentally unchanged since the post-war period. And those are, on the one hand, to position itself on the top of an international liberal capitalist order and to free up the global order for the interplay of capitalist markets, but in the interest of U.S. capital above all. And in Latin America, that meant politically, covertly or overtly, systematically undermining any threat, whether it is left nationalist, populist, and in a few instances, revolutionary challenges to U.S. imperial oversight, systematic efforts to undo those examples, even if in particular countries where there were these processes, the U.S. didn't have any immediate economic investments. The point was to undermine experiments such as the Nicaraguan Revolution between 1979 and 1990, just to take one example, to undermine them as threats of a good example for others to follow. And in the 1990s, with the left and the capacities of popular classes and oppressed groups being the lowest that they had been at any time in the last 150 years, the U.S. didn't need military intervention in the 1990s precisely because the left had already been defeated through massive military bureaucratic authoritarian regimes in the southern cone of South America, or through counterinsurgency measures of in Central America during the 1980s. So by the 1990s, the ideological military supremacy of the U.S. was expressed rather through the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, conditional loans, structural adjustment policies, and so on, rather than the overt military capacities that it had displayed before. Now, things start to change with the rise of the left in contradictory ways. At the end of the 1990s, it starts to be a concern of U.S. administrations that there is an emergence of what they're calling radical populist regimes, focusing mainly on Venezuela and to a lesser degree Bolivia and in some instances Ecuador under Rafael Correa. But in the early 2000s, of course, after 9/11, U.S. imperialism redirects its principal military attention to the Middle East with a series of interventions and wars. And so what you see is a period of relative autonomy in in Latin America with this turn to the left and this contradictory expression of center-left and left regimes, which on the one hand are interested in political, diplomatic, relative autonomy from the United States, but with much varying degrees of, in practice, subscribing to a radical anti-imperialism. So, for example, even in the cases where you have the most militant anti-imperialist rhetoric, such as the Bolivian government of Morales, if you take imperialism to include the imposition of multinational capital and the extraction and repatriation of profits with criminally low taxation, in those cases, you still have a continuity of multinational capital operating throughout the Morales period. Now, of course, some kind of negotiations would be necessary for any kind of transition to a new regime, but the depth of the continuity is quite striking. But you do see the creation of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations, which excludes for the first time Canada and the United States from its operations, and was in some ways an alternative to the Organization of American States, which had always been seen as an outpost of the American state itself. You saw the creation of ALBA, the Bank of the South, Sucre, the Regional Monetary Initiative, all of which were attempts principally by Venezuela, the People's Trade Agreement between Venezuela, Cuba, and Bolivia, to reassert itself as a relatively autonomous locales. And inside of that, and in response to that, you saw, for example, U.S. and Canadian support for after the coup attempt or the successful coup in Honduras in 2009, both Hillary Clinton and the regime of Stephen Harper in Canada were absolutely instrumental in preventing Manuel Zelaya, the democratically elected government, to resume his position in the presidency in Honduras, and instead backed and supported the reintegration of the authoritarian post-coup dictatorship in Honduras into the Organization of American States. We have extraordinary evidence of U.S. involvement in the funding of opposition in Venezuela to destabilize the government of Hugo Chavez, even before and after the brief coup of April 2002, subsequent financing of the opposition movement throughout to this day. So the continuity of U.S. imperialism persists, but as you said, I've just finished a recent book with Todd Gordon called Blood of Extraction, Canadian Imperialism in Latin America, which suggests that imperialism in Latin America is not reducible to the United States. Canada is involved massively in mining and finance in particular, and in the diplomatic efforts to secure those interests in the region. So at any one time, there are an extraordinary number of open social movements trying to contest Canadian mining multinationals who are dispossessing peasants and indigenous communities in the effort to accelerate the extraction of mining minerals and expatriate profit back to the Canadian headquarters. And as I suggested, there is also competition, and I think it ought to be called imperialist, by China inside of this new dynamic, despite the fact that center-left and left regimes describe China as a partner rather than an imposition. I think the asymmetry of that relationship belies that characterization.
All right, well, I had a very positive feeling coming out of this interview until we reached this subject of American intervention. And once again, we're back to the same old tricks. But we do have to end here. Now, we've been talking to Dr. Jeffery Weber, Professor of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary University of London. All TYT audience is now completely caught up with what's been going on in Latin America. Now, that's, of course, I'm partially facetious, but overall, this was an overview of where we stand. In the coming months, I would like to now dive into some specific countries in particular and discuss the situations there. Maybe we'll have Dr. Weber on again if you're willing to join us, and we'll get other experts in particular countries. Sure. So, Dr. Weber, I want to thank you very much for doing this interview and getting the TYT audience. There's no more excuses that we don't cover enough of Latin America. We are now all caught up, and we're going to continue this project on TYT interviews with me going forward. So thanks for being with us. We're going to wrap that up now. And
thanks very much for having me.
Glad to do it. And that's all for this on TYT interviews. Don't forget to support TYT by TYT Network facultad.com/join so that we can continue to bring you these interviews. Thank you.